Good evening and welcome to Poland Daily. I'm Nicholas Richardson and this is the news. Day 222 of the war in Ukraine. The Ukrainian counteroffensive is progressing in the Kherson region, where about 25,000 Russian soldiers seem to be surrounded on the right bank of the Dnieper. According to United States Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, the next successes of the Ukrainian army in this region will change the dynamics of the whole war. Last week, Vladimir Putin added 4 Ukrainian oblasts to Russia by decree. By means of nuclear threats, the Kremlin wants to maintain its jurisdiction over the annexed area. The annexation of these territories will not be significant for their nuclear protection. In addition, Russia is trying to ensure that China and India remain indifferent to this conflict. Today, the Italian daily La Repubblica reported that Russian submarine K-329, Belgorod, with 6 Poseidon missiles had left its base. The missiles are capable of triggering a radioactive tsunami. NATO has issued an intelligence report on this matter with a warning. The Belgorod ship is armed with an underwater nuclear drone named Poseidon. This is one of those types of weapons that Putin has been bragging about for a lot of years. So, in fact, against Ukraine, this Poseidon is unlikely to be used. It's a signal sent to the United States that somewhere it's been subbed in the Atlantic and they're going to try to send it towards the east coast. So it's a bluff, but it raises the stakes in this nuclear game. So far, over 60,000 Russian soldiers have died in the war. According to experts, the piling up of the failure of Russian troops on the front is a strong excuse for the Kremlin to use nuclear weapons in the conflict.
And do you take the threat? I mean, you have to take the
You
threat
have to take the threat seriously.
And I mean, he talked about a precedent set by the United States.
You have to take that seriously. And Jake Sullivan has publicly stated that the U.S. has communicated to Russia what would happen in response to that.
And what would happen?
Well, again, I have deliberately not talked to Jake about this.
Yeah.
I mean, just to give you a hypothetical, we would respond by leading a collective effort that would take out every Russian conventional force that we can see and identify on the battlefield in Ukraine, and also in Crimea and every ship in the Black Sea Fleet.
So it would bring America and NATO into the war. I mean, it would be an Article 5 situation, basically.
Not an Article 5 because they're not part of NATO, but it would be a U.S. and NATO response to something that is absolutely.
I mean, the argument's made the radiation would extend into NATO countries. It effectively would be an attack on NATO.
Yeah, and perhaps you can make that case. The other case is that this is so horrific that there has to be a response. It cannot go unanswered, but it doesn't expand. It's not nuclear for nuclear. You don't want to, again, get into a nuclear escalation here, but you have to show that this cannot be accepted in any way.
The threats are third rate. It's just propaganda. Putin, on the other hand, has already started to be openly aggressive towards NATO. The question is what happened in Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. According to experts, the nuclear blackmail by Vladimir Putin should be treated as an element of psychological warfare. Moscow's nuclear threats are an attempt to force Kiev to surrender through negotiation. Russia today will want to escalate primarily 3 elements, as I have been emphasizing for a long time: nuclear intimidation, energy intimidation, and mobilization intimidation. The possibility of this conflict escalating to a wider pan-European scale. Russia plans to buy potassium iodide. The agent effectively protects the thyroid against radioactive radiation. The Kremlin will allocate nearly 5 million rubles for this purpose. Experts have reassured that a nuclear attack against Ukraine is unlikely, and the current actions are routine and are carried out every year. In the absence of the ability to maintain occupied territory, which after so-called pseudo-referenda is treated as Russian, the only alternative may be the use of tactical nuclear weapons. Of course, such a move is a last resort and means a complete isolation of Russia internationally, additional economic sanctions, and eventually a retaliatory strike by the United States and NATO. Meanwhile, Ukrainian forces took the initiative in the annexed Kherson Oblast. Since Friday, Ukrainians have crossed the borders of the areas attached to Russia several times, regardless of Moscow's announcements about a possible nuclear retaliation. Taking control of this region will enable a double strike from the west and north, and will create the conditions for the encirclement of Russian forces in this area. At least twice a day I receive reports from our military personnel about the next successes of our counteroffensive. The list of estates liberated from the occupation is growing constantly. The liberation of Liman in the media caused the most emotions, but our successes are not limited to this city. Poland equivocally supports Ukraine's position on the illegal annexation of territories in the east of the country. Today, the Russian ambassador, Sergei Andreev, was summoned to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The ambassador learned about our position, heard our objection, and disagreed with the allegations. Meanwhile, the Russians are shelling the area of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant from time to time. According to experts, damage to its infrastructure may cause negative radiation effects. According to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Poland is prepared for the related potential nuclear threat. Today, Polish Foreign Minister Zbigniew Rau signed a diplomatic note on reparations, which will be handed over to Germany. It expresses the conviction that the parties should take immediate steps to regulate the consequences of the aggression and the German occupation between 1939 and 1945. Poland estimates these losses at 1.3 trillion euros. This settlement should include the payment of compensation by the Federal Republic of Germany for the tangible and intangible damage caused to the Polish state by this aggression and occupation. Compensating the victims of that occupation and members of their families for the damage and harm done to them, a systemic solution to the issue of seized Polish cultural property and archival records, returning the assets and liabilities of Polish state banks looted by the German state in 1939 to 1945, and taking effective measures by the German authorities to present to their own society a true picture of the war and its consequences. The process of obtaining these reparations, obtaining the German government to cover them, will be a long process. It will be a process full of various diplomatic efforts. On the Polish side, basically everything that needed to be done was done. Calculations were made. Anyway, this is not the first time, because in the past various calculations were also carried out. But it seems that these calculations are comprehensive. A note has been addressed, so now it's time to negotiate and prepare the treaty I mentioned, which can be called some kind of reconciliation settlement treaty that will settle these issues once and for all. Amazon founder Jeff Bezos' environmental fund is seeking to build a coalition of African and European countries around this year's United Nations Climate Summit to add weight to land restoration efforts. Ahead of COP27, taking place this November in Egypt, the Bezos Earth Fund is publishing plans to reverse deforestation and land degradation on 100 million hectares in Africa by 2030, said Andrew Steer, the fund's chief executive. The so-called Afra 100 initiative is led by African Union countries.
Even before the war in Ukraine and even before COVID, things were very unfair for Africa. I mean, African farmers are suffering, appallingly from climate change. And at a time like this, when rich countries have now spent, $16 trillion on ourselves during the COVID period, building back better, sadly, funding for developing countries has fallen. So what we've been trying to do, and then this year, obviously, with rising fuel prices, rising food prices, I think the World Bank now estimates 100 million people will fall back into poverty, not only in Africa, but worldwide.
Developing countries, meanwhile, are increasing demands for wealthier carbon-emitting nations to pay for climate-induced disasters like floods, fires, or famine.
One of the things that we're doing is trying to create a narrative that is a pro-growth, pro-poor, pro-resilient, pro-climate narrative. And landscape restoration fits all of those bills. So at the moment, Africa is a place where 60% of the soils have been degraded. And so by restoration, what we mean is a very simple idea. It is taking carbon up there in the atmosphere where it's causing a lot of trouble, is bringing it down to earth through the magic of photosynthesis into trees and bushes and crops and soils, where it brings, better incomes for farmers, better food security, more resilient soils, richer soils, healthier people, etc. I'm making it sound really great, and that's because it is great. And the good thing is there's now something called Africa 100, 100 million hectares of land in Africa to be brought back.
Bezos' philanthropy so far has pledged 30% of its $10 billion fund toward nature conservation, restoration, and food systems transformation. The actual grants it has issued total to a little over $1.5 billion, a fund spokesperson said. What partly distinguishes Bezos' fund are the principles for its operation, much like those guiding the bookseller he built into the world's largest online retailer. Frameworks like be obsessive about results and focus on people resemble language in Amazon's tenet of customer obsession. Bezos and partner Lorna Sanchez meet the fund's team monthly, according to Steer. The Amazon founder has prodded the fund to finance well-articulated ideas for combating climate change rather than focus on issues or targets generally, Steer said. That's the news. Thank you for watching. Stay with us for the weather, Poland Daily Business and more programmes. But from me, it's have a good night and a better tomorrow.